She spent it. Now she wants someone to blame, my mother said, and 16 relatives at Sunday dinner went quiet long enough for me to hear the ice settle in her glass. She was talking about the $27,400 my grandmother had saved for my nursing tuition, a certificate of deposit my parents had broken early and emptied while I was in clinicals, then blamed on me when the money was gone. 2 weeks later, I would learn they had forged a bank form, called my school to imply I was unstable, and asked our pastor to pressure me into dropping it. Then, one Tuesday morning, a woman knocked on my apartment door and said 7 words that changed everything. Before I go on, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love seeing where you're all listening from. My name is Lauren Bennett. I'm 24 years old. Now let me take you back to Cedar Falls, Iowa, in May of 2022. The dining room at my parents' house always smelled faintly like lemon polish and baked onions on Sundays. My mother, Diane Bennett, polished the table even when nobody was coming and cooked too much food even when only 6 people had confirmed. She liked the performance of family more than the reality of it. The light over the table had a yellow cast that made everybody look a little tired and a little softer than they really were, which I used to think was mercy. By that Sunday, I understood it as camouflage. It was May 15th, 2022, and I had driven over after a 6-hour shift as a student nurse tech at Mercy One in Waterloo. I still had the indent on the bridge of my nose from my hospital mask. My scrubs were in a folded tote bag in the trunk because my mother hated seeing me come to dinner looking like I had worked. She said it made the evening feel clinical. I remember that because she had once said it while I was still in my grandmother's kitchen, and Grandma June had looked up from peeling potatoes and said, "Work is not something to hide, Diane. Some of us still respect it." My mother had smiled and changed the subject, which was her preferred method of losing a battle. My father, Richard Bennett, sat at the head of the table with his sleeves rolled to the forearms, and that expression he wore when he wanted to look like the reasonable one. He was 54 then, broad-shouldered, thinning hair, the kind of man who could sound thoughtful while saying something cruel if he lowered his voice enough. He worked in commercial roofing sales and believed paperwork was just a prettier way to get what you wanted. My younger brother, Connor, 21, sat halfway down the table, phone face down beside his water glass, pretending neutrality with all the effort of a child holding still in church. He is the secondary villain in this story, if I am being fair. Not because he built the trap, but because he helped bait it, and because there is damage in standing near a fire and calling it warmth. My grandmother, June, had died 8 months earlier. Her funeral was in September of 2021, held in a Methodist church in Waverly with white mums that smelled slightly peppery and hymn books soft at the corners from so many hands. She had been 69 when she died, all clear eyes and pressed blouses and hard truths spoken in a low voice. She had worked for 32 years as a receptionist at an agricultural equipment office and kept every statement, every receipt, every birthday card in labeled accordion files in a hall closet. She did not trust memory where paper would do. That is one of the reasons I won. Grandma June and I had always been close in the practical way that survives sentiment. She taught me to sew on buttons, check fluid in my car, roast a chicken, and read the fine print before signing anything. When I was 16 and had my first panic about college costs after overhearing my parents argue over money, she took me to First Prairie Community Bank on Main Street in Waverly. It was August 11th, 2014, humid enough that the bank door felt cool and strange on my skin. She opened a certificate of deposit for $20,000 in both our names, payable to either, with me designated as the intended education beneficiary in notes her advisor kept in my file. I know that phrase sounds dry, but to me it felt like a bridge appearing where there had been only water. She added to it over the years. A tax refund one spring, $3,000 from selling an old camping trailer, 500 here, 1,000 there. Every birthday, she gave me a card with a $20 bill and a reminder that the real gift was not having to ask people for permission to build your life. By January of 2022, with accumulated interest, the CD had reached $27,400. I knew the amount because she told me the week before she died. We were sitting at her kitchen table with coffee gone cold because the hospice nurse had just left, and neither of us wanted to say the large thing out loud. She touched my hand and said, "That money is for school, not rent, not family emergencies, not smoothing over your parents' mistakes. School. Promise me you will use it for yourself." I promised. At the time, I was finishing prerequisites and applying to the nursing program at Hawkeye Community College. It was not glamorous, but it was solid, respected, and close enough that I could keep working. My tuition, books, uniforms, fees, and first semester expenses were going to come in just under $19,000. The plan was simple. I would use the CD to pay tuition and related costs, keep my hospital job, live carefully, and finish with as little debt as possible. My parents knew this. My mother had even bragged about it to church friends as if she had arranged it, saying, "Lauren has this lovely nest egg from June for school, such a blessing." I remember smiling tightly and changing the subject because with my mother, possession was often 9/10 of narration. After Grandma died, I did what grieving daughters and granddaughters are trained to do. I helped. I sorted casseroles, wrote thank you notes, labeled pictures for the memorial board, and sat in the front pew, wearing a black dress that suddenly felt too small through the ribs. My mother cried elegantly. My father shook hands with people and said, "June always adored Lauren," like he was speaking on behalf of history. Aunt Sheila, my mother's older cousin, squeezed my shoulder in the fellowship hall and whispered, "Your grandmother worried about you, not because of you, because of what they ask of you." At the time I thought she meant emotional labor. I did not yet understand how literal it would become. The first wound was not the theft itself. It was the small rearrangements around it. In October, my mother began asking oddly casual questions. Had I decided which semester to start? Did I need all those extra books? Was nursing really the best fit if I tired so easily after shifts? She phrased concern like a seamstress. Neat, measured, all little hidden cuts. My father asked if I had considered delaying a year until the economy settles, which was a strange thing to say to someone entering healthcare. Connor joked at Thanksgiving that if I ever made real nurse money, I could buy everyone steaks. My mother laughed too hard at that. I was living in a one-bedroom apartment on West 4th Street in Cedar Falls then, with beige carpet that always smelled faintly of dust after the heat kicked on, and a kitchen window that looked out over a cracked parking lot. It was not much, but it was mine. I paid $745 a month in rent, plus utilities, plus gas for the 20-minute commute to Waterloo. My life was spreadsheet simple. I worked, I studied, I ate too many apples with peanut butter standing at the sink. I went to bed with anatomy terms in my head. If I cried, which happened more than I told anyone, it was from being tired, not lost. The person who knew the rhythm of my life best was Melissa Grant, a respiratory therapist in her early 30s who rented the apartment across the hall. She was my quiet, steady character in all this. She never pushed and never lectured. She had a son in second grade, a silver Honda with one stubborn dent in the rear bumper, and a habit of leaving a paper bag with homemade muffins on my doormat before big exam days. The first time I told her about the CD, it was not because I wanted sympathy. It was because she saw me in the hallway with a stack of forms and said, "You look like somebody gave you a future and then attached homework to it." I laughed so hard I leaned against the wall. By spring, I had been accepted into the fall nursing cohort. I still remember the exact sound my phone made when the email came in on March 9, 2022, at 7:14 in the morning. A small, bright chime in my kitchen while the coffee maker hissed. I sat down on the linoleum in my socks and read the acceptance letter 3 times, with my heart beating in my throat. I called Melissa first because she had just gotten home from an overnight shift and answered on the second ring, sounding half asleep and instantly thrilled. I called my parents second. My mother cried. My father said, "See, hard work pays off," as if he had somehow sweated over my chemistry lab reports. The next step was paying my deposit and finalizing financials for orientation. I planned to go to First Prairie on April 21st, my next day off, to discuss the CD and process the disbursement schedule so I would not trigger unnecessary penalties. The account was still set to mature in late August, but I knew there could be an education exception, or at least a strategy. That morning, I wore jeans, a navy cardigan, and the sneakers with the worn left heel, because I knew I would be on my feet all day afterward. The bank smelled like printer toner, carpet shampoo, and the peppermints they kept in a crystal bowl by the teller line. It was quiet, except for the low hum of the air conditioner. A teller named Evan, maybe 20, looked at my ID, typed my name, then typed it again. His fingers slowed. He gave me a polite, strained smile and said, "One moment. Let me get someone from the office." Even now, I can feel the change in my skin at that sentence. It was not fear yet. It was the body recognizing the floor had shifted before the mind had language for it. The branch manager, Todd Mercer, led me into a glass office with a fake ficus in the corner and a framed print of a red barn on the wall. He closed the door and sat down carefully, palms flat on a folder. He told me the CD had been closed on April 12th. The funds, $26,682 after the early withdrawal penalty, had been disbursed by cashier's check. For a few seconds I thought there must be a second account, a duplicate name, some clerical mistake so boring it would be fixed in 2 keystrokes. Then he slid a photocopy toward me. I looked at a withdrawal form with my printed name, a signature meant to resemble mine, and my parents' home address written in the contact box. I also saw the notation, "Customer present, ID verified." I was not present. On April 12th, from 6:45 in the morning until 7:12 that evening, I was at Mercy 1. I still had the text Melissa sent me at 5:30 asking if I could grab milk on the way home. I still had the badge log from the employee entrance. My stomach felt cold. I asked who had closed it. Todd said because the account was payable to either owner and because one signer had presented documentation, the bank had processed it. He would not say more. He used the kind voice institutions reserve for people they intend to stonewall. I asked whether my grandmother's death certificate had been involved. He nodded once. I asked whose ID had been used. He said he needed to check with compliance. That was when I understood this was not just ugly, it was documented. I walked out of the bank into sharp April sunlight and stood beside my car with my keys in my hand, not moving. A school bus hissed at the curb nearby. Somebody in the coffee shop next door was laughing. I called my mother first, because some buried, foolish part of me still believed there had to be an explanation that would make the world ordinary again. She answered on the third ring. I asked if she and Dad had closed Grandma's CD. There was a pause so clean and flat it told me everything. Then she said, "We accessed the funds for the family. You were going to waste it on living expenses before school even started." Her tone was managerial, almost bored. I asked what "we" meant, and she said, "Your father handled the bank. Legally, it was complicated after June passed, and we did what was necessary." I said, "You forged my name." She said, "Do not use ugly words when you don't understand adult finances." That sentence changed something permanent in me. Not because it was the cruelest thing she ever said, but because it revealed the architecture. They had not panicked and taken money in a moment of weakness. They had built a story in which my future was a negotiable family asset, and my objection was evidence of immaturity. That is how long it took them to erase me. About 90 seconds on a phone call in a grocery store parking lot. I called my father next. He did not deny it either. He said the roof on their house had needed emergency work after winter ice damage, that Connor's truck transmission had gone out, and that family money should serve family. I reminded him it was not family money, it was mine for school. He said, "You don't get to claim singular ownership over what your grandmother intended for all of us." When I told him there was a forged signature on the form, he got angry in that dangerous, quiet way of his and said, "Watch yourself. You're not accusing me of a crime over a misunderstanding." I said, "I am telling you what happened." He hung up. That night, in my apartment, I spread every nursing school paper I had across my table, like I could somehow anchor my future with paper clips. Tuition estimate, uniform list, immunization requirements, drug screen instructions, background check forms. The absurdity was almost funny. I had prepared for every official process except the one where my own parents would try to empty the bridge before I crossed it. Melissa knocked around 9 with a foil pan of baked ziti balanced on one hand. She took one look at me and said, "Do you need food or witnesses?" It was the right question. I told her everything, from the bank office to my mother's phrase, "for the family." She listened without interrupting, knees angled toward me on the thrifted armchair by the window. When I finished, she did not offer false comfort. She picked up my phone, opened the Notes app, and said, "Start from the top and give me dates." That was her specific, memorable action. Not a hug, though she gave me one later. A timeline, a spine. We built the first version that night. August 11th, 2014. CD opened. January 26, 2022. Grandma told me final amount. March 9th. Acceptance email. April 12th. Fraudulent withdrawal. April 21st. Bank discovery. We listed who had known what and when. We saved screenshots of call logs. We backed up texts to cloud storage. Melissa made me photograph my school acceptance packet next to that day's newspaper because she said, "I don't know what game they're playing yet, but if anyone later claims you invented nursing school to dramatize this, I want timestamps." She had seen enough of human behavior in hospitals to know where disbelief likes to hide. The next morning, I called the nursing program office and explained that I might need a short extension on my deposit while resolving a bank dispute. I did not tell them my parents had stolen my tuition. I said there had been an unauthorized withdrawal from an education account under review. The coordinator, Ms. Perez, was kind but formal. She granted me 2 weeks, 14 days. I wrote it down in blue ink and stared at the number as if concentration could turn it into more. That is the thing about betrayal when money is involved. It arrives with deadlines. I returned to the bank on April 22nd and requested copies of every document tied to the closure. I was told I could submit a written dispute, which I did. I asked for surveillance retention confirmation. I asked for the teller station number. I asked for the signature card from account opening. Todd Mercer became noticeably less smooth as the conversation went on. He had expected distress. He had not expected precision. There is a different kind of power in being the calmest person in a room where somebody hopes you'll sound irrational. By evening, my mother had already called twice and left one voicemail. In it, she said, in a voice sticky with wounded dignity, "Your father is beside himself that you would humiliate us over paperwork. Call me before this gets out of hand." I saved the voicemail. Then I saved it again in 2 more places. If you are ever in a situation like this, save the tone as carefully as the words. Tone is where contempt forgets to hide. The first escalation came from the family group text, which my mother titled simply Sunday Crew, as if reducing adulthood to a dinner habit made us all harmless. On April 23rd, at 9:18 in the morning, she sent, "Please pray for Lauren, as she is going through a very confusing emotional time and making serious accusations." Then she followed with, "We love her, and no grief affects people differently." That was how she introduced her defense. Not with facts, with diagnosis. Within an hour, I had messages from Aunt Sheila, my cousin Beth, a neighbor from church, and two women from the congregation who had known me since youth group. They all sounded variations of the same note: concerned, soft, slightly patronizing. Had I considered that there might be a misunderstanding? Was I sure stress from school wasn't making things feel bigger? Did I really want to drag my father's name through legal channels over family money? The phrase family money traveled quickly because it was easier to digest than the truth. It made my resistance sound greedy instead of injured. I responded to each politely and almost identically. There is an unauthorized withdrawal on a joint education certificate of deposit. I am gathering records. I won't discuss details until I have complete documentation. Thank you for checking in. Politeness can be a wall if you build it square enough. A few people backed off. Others took my calm as a sign that perhaps it was less serious than I claimed. Women learn early that measured pain is often discounted. I kept measuring it anyway. Connor called me that afternoon. He opened with, "Can we not make this into some whole thing?" Which told me instantly that it was already a whole thing in the house where he still lived. His transmission repair, it turned out, had cost $3,200 in February. My parents had covered it. He knew, at least in outline, where part of the money came from. He said Dad had planned to replace it before you actually needed it, and that I was being rigid by not understanding timing. I asked if he knew there was a forged signature. He was quiet, then said, "I didn't ask." That was his form of guilt then. Passive voice, no subject. I asked him one direct question. Had he gone to the bank with Dad? He said no too quickly, then corrected himself and said he had driven Dad because Mom had a dental appointment. He claimed he stayed in the truck. I wrote that down, not because I believed him, because lies should be preserved at their original size. On April 25th, I filed a police report with Cedar Falls because my residence was there and the financial harm affected me there, though the bank branch was in Waverly. The officer at the front desk, a woman named Sergeant Alicia Kemp with reading glasses tucked into the neck of her uniform, treated me with a seriousness that steadied me more than she probably knew. She asked clear questions. She did not flinch when I said, "My father signed my name on a withdrawal form and my mother is now telling people I'm unstable." She typed steadily and said, "Family cases are messy, but documents are documents." I left with a report number and a copy warm from the printer. The paper smelled faintly of toner. I slept with it on my nightstand that night like a talisman. The second escalation came from the church. My parents attended Grace Fellowship in Cedar Falls every Sunday and had for 19 years. My mother chaired the funeral meal committee. My father ran men's breakfast twice a month. Their social credit there was deep and annoyingly well maintained. On April 27th, Pastor Neil Hargrove emailed asking if I would meet with him to seek peace before this becomes adversarial. Even the phrase irritated me. It implied conflict had not already crossed a line, as if crime only becomes uncomfortable once the victim names it. I agreed to meet because documentation matters, and because declining would have been folded into their narrative as proof of volatility. Melissa came with me but waited in the fellowship hall with a paperback and a styrofoam cup of coffee because I wanted a witness nearby without turning the meeting into a showdown. Pastor Neil was in his late 40s, earnest, pink-faced, with the unfortunate habit of touching his wedding ring whenever he said something he knew he should have thought harder about. He began with prayer, then said my parents were heartbroken that I had involved police before pursuing reconciliation. I told him calmly that I had pursued clarification with the bank and with my parents first. I told him the account was for education. The amount withdrawn was $26,682 after penalty, and there was a false signature on file. He shifted in his chair and asked if it was possible my father signed under some confusion related to account authority. I said, "Pastor, if a stranger did this to me, would we call it confusion?" He blinked. Then he asked whether I would consider pausing formal action to preserve family unity. I said no. When I stood to leave, he said one thing that stayed with me. Sometimes truth and healing don't arrive in the same order. I did not like him very much in that moment, but he was right. Healing was nowhere in sight. Truth was a file cabinet I was assembling one document at a time. That evening, my mother texted, "I hear you met with Neil. It breaks my heart that you are turning ordinary financial help between family members into public shame." I responded, "Do not contact my school, my workplace, or anyone representing me." She wrote back, "Nobody is representing you. You are a child playing at adulthood." I saved that too. By then I had called an attorney. Her name was Denise Callahan, 61, family and civil litigator in Waterloo, gray bob, pearl stud earrings, voice like crisp paper. She was not the named older woman required by fate in this story, but she mattered. I found her through a recommendation from one of the unit secretaries at the hospital whose sister had used her in a probate dispute. Denise met me on April 28th in an office that smelled like old books and coffee and had the cleanest desk I have ever seen. She read my notes in silence for 15 minutes, then looked up and said, "Your parents are betting on your reluctance, your age, and their community standing. We can work with that." It was one of the most comforting things anyone said to me. She instructed me to stop taking phone calls from my parents and communicate only in writing when possible. She had me request, by certified letter, complete bank records including the original account agreement, signature card, death certificate use log, withdrawal request, teller notes, transaction authorization, and video retention documentation. She also had me send a preservation notice to the bank's legal department. Then she asked for copies of my work schedule and badge access logs for April 12th, plus any receipts showing my whereabouts that day. I produced all of it within 48 hours. Calm is easier when you have tasks. My parents escalated again anyway. On May 2nd, the nursing program office called to verify a concern someone had raised about whether I was currently emotionally fit for cohort intensity. The wording was too strange to be organic. My skin went hot. I asked who had contacted them, and they would not say, only that an anonymous call had referenced family instability and a possible upcoming legal issue. That was when I understood my mother was not just defending herself. She was trying to contaminate the institutions around me, so that even if I got the money back, I would still lose momentum. Criminal theft had moved toward deliberate career sabotage. I immediately emailed Ms. Perez, attached the police report number, and requested that any future third-party claims about my mental state or suitability be disregarded unless made through formal channels with documentation. I also asked Denise to send a notice to the school explaining that I was the victim of a financial dispute involving relatives and that any defamatory contact should be preserved. Denise did so in language so exact it felt like architecture. The school responded professionally and placed my file under heightened note review. It was humiliating and protective at once. There are losses that come even when you do everything right. I still needed money. Deadlines did not pause just because my parents had turned my life into evidence. I picked up extra shifts at the hospital and sold 2 pieces of furniture I could live without, a bookshelf and a small dining set Grandma had actually given me, which nearly undid me. Melissa found me sitting on the floor after the buyers left, staring at the square marks the table legs had left in the carpet. She did not tell me I was strong. She brought me a screwdriver, helped me take apart the remaining shelf in my closet so I could list that too, and said, "Temporary does not mean defeated." I wrote that one down later. On May 5th, First Prairie's compliance department called. A woman named Sandra Liu explained that they were reviewing procedural irregularities tied to my dispute. She would not elaborate, but she asked whether I had ever provided the branch with an updated address after moving to Cedar Falls. I said no. She asked whether I had ever authorized my parents to act on my behalf regarding the CD. I said absolutely not. She thanked me in the clipped, controlled tone of someone beginning to understand that a local branch had made a nationally reportable mistake. That same day, Aunt Sheila called and asked if she could come by. She arrived carrying a loaf of banana bread and wearing a denim jacket that smelled faintly of garden soil and lavender hand cream. She was 67, not glamorous, with short silver hair and the blunt kindness of women who have outlived the need to soften every truth. She is the named older woman in this story, and she was present both for the original betrayal and the reveal. She had been in the kitchen the week after Grandma's funeral, when my mother and father thought nobody was listening carefully. She heard my father say, "The CD can cover the roof if we move before Lauren starts asking for account numbers." She had looked up from rinsing casserole dishes and said, "June earmarked that money for school." My mother had replied, "June is gone, Sheila. The family still has bills." Aunt Sheila told me all this in my apartment, with the banana bread untouched between us. I asked her why she had not told me sooner. She did not flinch. "Because I thought your father was bluffing, and because I have spent too many years in this family, assuming ugly things would stop 1 inch before criminal." Then she put a folded napkin on my coffee table. Inside was a small note in Grandma's compact handwriting on the back of a church bulletin. It read, "CD for Lauren's nursing. Diane asked if funds could help with house. I said no. If anything happens, papers are with Marjorie at Caldwell Financial." I stared at that note until the words blurred. Marjorie Caldwell. I had heard the name before. She was my grandmother's financial advisor for years, a widow in Waverly with horn-rimmed glasses and a reputation for remembering every person's account history better than they did. Aunt Sheila said Grandma had trusted her because she didn't do flattery and didn't lose paper. I called Caldwell Financial the next morning and left a message. By noon, a woman with a low, steady voice called back and said, "This is Marjorie Caldwell. I wondered when someone would finally ask the right question." Marjorie was 72. She spoke as if every sentence had been sorted before delivery. She remembered my grandmother immediately. She remembered the CD. More importantly, she remembered that in January of 2021, after my mother had raised the idea of using some of the funds for house repairs, Grandma had asked Marjorie to note in her client file that the certificate was intended exclusively for my tuition and not to be diverted for family household expenses. Marjorie said, "Your grandmother was not sentimental about money, she was precise. There is a difference." She agreed to look for any relevant paperwork and call me back. That phone call was the first moment in 2 weeks I allowed myself to feel something like hope, which is a dangerous thing when you are still in the middle of being publicly miscast. By then, my mother had told enough people that I was spiraling that even the cashier at our old grocery store looked at me with cautious sympathy. I started driving to a different Hy-Vee to avoid it. My father, meanwhile, remained mostly silent except for one certified letter from his attorney friend, not actually representing him formally, but apparently eager to sound important, suggesting I refrain from making defamatory statements against my parents. Denise laughed without smiling when she read it and said, "Good. They are scared enough to reach for bad law." She drafted a response so efficient it looked surgical. The branch documents began arriving in pieces: signature card from 2014, original deposit amounts, renewal notices mailed tellingly to my parents' address, despite the fact I had been an adult with my own residence for years, transaction logs, internal note entries. On the April 12th withdrawal ticket, the signature in my name had a rounded capital L I have never used. The teller initials belonged to an employee named Jenna Roth. There was also a notation indicating second customer remained in lobby. Connor had not stayed in the truck after all. Again, I wrote it down. Truth becomes a stronger shape each time a lie fails to fit around it. Then the surveillance problem emerged. The branch had a 30-day overwrite cycle unless footage was flagged. Because I had reported the issue on April 21st, 9 days after the transaction, there was a chance the video still existed. Sandra Liu called on May 10th and said footage from the lobby and teller line had been preserved. She would not discuss contents. That silence was not an answer, but it was not a dismissal either. Around this point, I want to ask you something directly. If your own mother told people you were unstable so she could keep money taken from your future, what would hurt more? The theft itself, or the way other people seemed relieved to believe her because it made their lives simpler? I know my answer now. At the time, I was still learning it. On May 12th, I had a second meeting with Pastor Neil because he requested one after receiving new information. Melissa waited again, this time with a crossword and no coffee, because she said church coffee tasted like boiled cardboard. Pastor Neil looked more subdued. He said my mother had asked the church prayer chain not to contact me anymore because Lauren is reacting unpredictably. He then said, awkwardly, that a bank employee's relative attended Grace Fellowship and had mentioned there was indeed some sort of ongoing internal review at First Prairie. He never named names. Small towns do not need names to move data. He asked whether I needed any practical help. I told him I needed people to stop treating accountability like aggression. He nodded and looked ashamed. The third escalation came on May 14th, the day before the Sunday dinner, where my mother would make her speech about me spending it. She texted the family group inviting everyone over because it is time to clear the air. That phrase should have warned me more than it did. I almost declined. Denise had told me to avoid unnecessary contact, but Aunt Sheila said she would be there, and so would Marjorie if she could make the drive down because they had arranged to attend the same memorial quilting circle in town that afternoon. I said yes, partly because I was tired of absence being used as confession. I did not know then that Marjorie had already found something else in her files. Not just notes. Original beneficiary correspondence from Grandma June, a signed instruction sheet discussing educational intent, and one handwritten memo after a consultation where Grandma stated, "If Richard or Diane attempt to access funds for home or Connor, deny and document. Lauren is not to be pressured." There are moments when the dead seem to reach back not with emotion, but with filing systems. My grandmother loved me in paper. Sunday dinner began the way all family humiliations do, with normal food, ham glazed too sweet, cheesy potatoes, green beans with slivered almonds, rolls warming under a towel, somebody's baby monitor static crackling faintly from a purse in the hallway, people choosing seats based on old alliances so instinctively they would have denied doing it. My mother wore a cream cardigan and pearl earrings. My father had one extra drink before everyone sat down, which I noticed because the ice bin was lower than usual. Connor avoided my eyes. For the first 10 minutes, everyone performed civility. Beth asked about her preschooler. Uncle Darrell complained about gas prices. Aunt Sheila buttered her roll with methodical care. Then my cousin mentioned tuition costs in general, and my mother seized the opening like a stage cue. She set down her fork, made a small pained smile, and said, "Well, speaking of money, we've been carrying quite a burden with Lauren's accusations. She spent it. Now she wants someone to blame." That was the line you heard at the beginning. The room went quiet in that hungry, attentive way some families mistake for concern. My mother continued, saying I had always been impulsive, that grief and stress had clouded my memory, that my father had merely tried to help me organize the funds, and I now regretted how quickly they were gone. It was brilliant in a cheap way. She made me sound both irresponsible and confused. My father added only one sentence. "We're praying she comes back to herself." It almost would have worked if paper were not already moving toward us. I did not argue. I took a sip of water and set my glass down carefully. Aunt Sheila looked at me once, then at the back door leading to the patio. There was movement there, a silhouette, then a knock on the glass. My mother frowned because she hates unplanned arrivals. Connor half stood. My father turned in his chair. Aunt Sheila said very clearly, "That will be Marjorie." Marjorie Caldwell entered carrying a weathered leather portfolio and wearing a navy raincoat despite the clear evening, as if she trusted paperwork more than forecasts. She was taller than I expected, fine-boned, with soft white hair cut just below the jaw and a gold pen clipped inside her blouse pocket. She had the manner of women who spent decades being underestimated by men with louder voices and solving that problem through accuracy. My mother stood and put on her hostess smile so quickly it looked painful. "Marjorie, what a surprise!" Marjorie replied. "Not really, Diane. I called your landline at 3 and no one answered." That first exchange shifted the room. Not enough to expose anyone yet, but enough to announce that this visitor belonged to facts, not feelings. Marjorie declined food. She thanked Aunt Sheila for the invitation and said she would only take a few minutes. Then she looked at me, not theatrically, just directly, and said, "Lauren, I brought the file your grandmother asked me to keep." You could feel every fork on that table become irrelevant. What happened next is important for one reason above all. I did not vindicate myself. I did not stand up, point, or perform outrage. Under the proxy rule that life sometimes imposes on women who are already tired, another person opened the box. Or in this case, the portfolio. Marjorie set it on the table between the rolls and the casserole dish, as if setting down one more ordinary object. She withdrew a manila folder secured with a red string and untied it with precise fingers. The little scrape of cardboard against laminate sounded louder than it should have. She began with the original account summary from August 11, 2014. Certificate of deposit opened by June Whitaker in the amount of $20,000, payable to either June Whitaker or Lauren Bennett. Then she set down a duplicate of Grandma's later signed instruction, dated January 7, 2021. Her voice never rose. Client note: funds reserved exclusively for granddaughter Lauren Bennett's nursing education. Client expressly declined daughter Diane Bennett's request to divert any portion toward home repairs. My mother's hand tightened around her napkin. My father stopped chewing. Marjorie did not look at them while she read. That was the elegant part. She treated the documents, not the people, as the center of gravity. Next came Grandma's memo, handwritten and signed, with Marjorie's notation and initials. If Richard or Diane attempt to access funds for House or Connor, deny and document. Lauren is not to be pressured. Aunt Sheila closed her eyes briefly, then opened them and said, June wrote exactly what she meant. It was the first spoken family alignment I had heard in weeks that did not ask me to be smaller. My mother tried to interrupt. "I don't think this is appropriate at dinner," Marjorie said. Appropriateness was available earlier. Then she produced a copy of the branch dispute acknowledgement and a note she had added after speaking to First Prairie's regional office that morning. Because she had been listed for years as June Whitaker's advisor of record, and because she was now assisting in clarifying intent, the regional office had spoken more freely with her than with me. Not about final legal conclusions, but about enough. She said, "The branch has confirmed an internal compliance review is active regarding the April 12th closure. There are concerns about signature mismatch and identification procedure." She slid a second photocopy across the table. It was the withdrawal form. The fake signature looked worse under dining room light. Amateur, hurried, overly careful in all the wrong places. Marjorie placed beside it a photocopy of my real signature from the original account documents. The difference was plain. Even Beth, who had come prepared to believe the best of everyone except me, leaned forward and stared. Todd Mercer had accepted this. Jenna Roth had processed this. My father had walked out with a cashier's check on the strength of that lie. Community standing had carried him through a teller line. Then came the outsider reveal that neither my parents nor I had fully anticipated. Marjorie was not alone. She had brought an envelope from First Prairie's Regional Compliance Unit addressed to me, delivered to her office by courier because I had missed the call while working. She said she had not opened it. She handed it across the table to Aunt Sheila and said, "Would you read this? My eyesight in this light is less forgiving than it used to be." That was the moment the proxy extended again. Not me. Not Marjorie. Aunt Sheila, older woman, witness to the original betrayal, now witness to the consequence. Aunt Sheila opened the envelope with the butter knife from beside her plate, because nobody had a letter opener, and the improvisation somehow made it more devastating. Inside was a formal letter on bank letterhead. Her reading voice was steady, the voice of a woman who had read church bulletins, eulogies, and school programs for 40 years, and knew how to let words land. Dear Ms. Bennett, following review of your dispute regarding account ending 1937, we have identified significant procedural failures in the closure of Certificate of Deposit account ending 6421 on April 12, 2022. The transaction is under fraud investigation. Based on available documentation and surveillance review, the branch cannot verify that you were present or that the signature accepted was authentic. The room changed shape around that sentence. My cousin's baby monitor crackled once from the hallway and then went silent. Uncle Darrell set his fork down too carefully. Connor looked at the tabletop as if it had become dangerous. My father reached for his water, missed the base slightly, and tipped the glass into his lap as he started to stand. Ice slid against the plate edge. That was his physical reaction. Not dramatic enough for television. Perfect for real life. Aunt Sheila continued reading, because once older women decide to finish a thing, they finish it. The bank letter stated that funds equivalent to the withdrawn amount had been provisionally credited pending final resolution, that the matter had been referred to the institution's fraud and legal departments, and that any employee misconduct would be handled internally. It also advised me to maintain the police report and preserve all communications. There it was, in front of the same people who had just heard my mother describe me as confused and irresponsible. A bank. In writing. Saying the opposite. My mother put one hand flat on the table and said, too quickly, "This doesn't prove anything about intent." It was a foolish sentence. People only talk about intent when action is already obvious. Marjorie turned to her then for the first time and said, "Diane, your mother made her intent plain. The bank's mistake does not erase your request. Richard's signature does not become Lauren's because you prefer the story that way." My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. Connor surprised me next, not with heroism, with a crack. He said very quietly, "Dad had me drive him." Everybody turned. He swallowed and added, "I was in the lobby. I saw him sign because he said Lauren was at work and it was easier this way." He started to say more and stopped. It was not redemption. It was the beginning of genuine reckoning, and it cost him something to do it in that room. I noted that too, though not on paper. My father sat back down. He did not launch into defense. He looked at the puddles spreading across his khakis and said, in a small broken voice I had never heard from him before, "It was supposed to be temporary." Silence met him. Not outrage, not rescue, just the absence of a story sturdy enough to hold him. If you have ever wondered what accountability sounds like in a family dining room, it is not thunder. It is cutlery no one reaches for. It is a chair creaking because somebody shifts and then decides not to leave. It is your own pulse becoming audible, because for the first time in weeks, reality has more witnesses than the lie. Aunt Sheila folded the letter once and set it beside my plate. She did not hand it back to Marjorie or keep reading. She looked at my mother and said, "You called her unstable to protect yourselves from a paper trail. That is a low thing to do to a daughter." My mother made a tiny movement with her shoulders, as if preparing to cry, but no tears came. I think she understood in that moment that the performance which had worked for decades was failing under fluorescent light and explicit dates. The next 20 minutes moved strangely, half-frozen and hyper-detailed. Beth took her toddler into the living room without speaking. Uncle Darrell muttered something about needing air and went out front. My cousin's husband, a man who usually never involved himself in anything beyond grilling, quietly asked Marjorie if she wanted a glass of water. She said no. Small acts reveal allegiance before people are ready to state it outright. Nobody defended my parents. That mattered. Then my phone buzzed. It was Denise. I had texted her earlier to say I was attending the dinner and Marjorie might bring paperwork. I stepped into the hallway to answer. I could still smell ham glaze and coffee from the kitchen behind me. Denise said the bank had just copied her on a parallel notice and that we should meet Monday morning to discuss next steps, including a possible civil demand and cooperation with any criminal inquiry. Her voice stayed measured, but I heard approval in it. "Do not engage tonight beyond what is necessary to leave safely," she said. "The truth has entered the room. It can do its own work for a few hours." When I went back in, Marjorie was repacking her portfolio. She placed Grandma's original notes into a separate envelope for me and said, "Keep these somewhere dry and know where your mother can reach." There was nothing theatrical in the instruction, which made it more moving. Aunt Sheila stood, took her purse, and asked if I was ready to go. Again, not drama. Logistics. Chosen loyalty often looks like practical exit strategies. Before I left, I finally said one thing. I looked at my parents and said, "Do not contact my school again. Do not contact my employer. All communication goes through my attorney." My mother stared at the edge of the table. My father did not answer. Connor said, "Lauren," as if he wanted forgiveness to be available by saying my name correctly for once. It wasn't. Not then. Maybe not now. Outside, the evening air felt almost cold after the crowded heat of the dining room. The patio smelled like damp soil and citronella from a candle someone had lit before dinner. Aunt Sheila walked with me to my car while Marjorie got into her sedan and sat for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel, gathering herself. Before she drove off, she rolled down her window and said, "Your grandmother would have hated the scene and loved the documentation." I laughed in a way that hurt and healed at the same time. That night I did not cry until I was home. Melissa heard my key in the apartment door and opened hers almost immediately, still in scrub pants and a faded t-shirt from some pediatric fundraiser. She looked at the envelope in my hand and the expression on my face and said, "They finally met paper, didn't they?" I nodded. She took the envelope, set it gently on my kitchen counter, and microwaved the tea she had made an hour earlier because she said cold tea after vindication was too sad. There are women who save you without ever announcing they are doing it. The next morning, the story began to move through our community without my help. I did not post online. I did not call people. I did not forward the bank letter to every relative who had suggested I was grieving too loudly. I simply went to Denise's office at 9 and placed the original documents in front of her one by one. Word spread anyway because truth in a small town has a scent, and because the people who witnessed dinner went home to spouses and sisters and one trusted friend each. By Tuesday, 2 women from church who had texted me those soft, patronizing messages sent new ones. One said, "I am sorry, I did not know the facts." Another said, "I should have believed you when you used the word forged." I appreciated the apologies in the way you appreciate a bandage after the stitches are in. Useful, late. The formal reveal in the dining room was only the beginning. Real revenge, if you can call it that, is usually paperwork completed after everyone else has gone home. On May 16th, Denise and I met for 2.5 hours. She had highlighted the bank letter, cross-referenced it with the police report, and already drafted a civil demand for restitution of the remaining loss, incidental damages tied to my delayed enrollment costs, and preservation of all family communications regarding the CD. Because the bank had provisionally credited the withdrawn amount, my immediate tuition crisis eased, but the underlying liability and fraud issues remained. There was also the school interference. Denise believed we had enough to send a separate cease and desist regarding defamatory contacts to my nursing program and workplace. She explained my options in the plainest terms possible. The bank might reimburse me fully and then pursue my father or any complicit party directly. Law enforcement might or might not bring charges depending on referral and local prosecutorial appetite for family fraud. Civilly, we could seek damages if my enrollment delay or reputational harm created measurable loss. I remember sitting in her office with a legal pad in front of me, hearing all this, and thinking how strange it is that adulthood sometimes arrives not with freedom, but with folders. Denise tapped her pen once and said, "You do not need to decide everything today. You only need to keep deciding the next correct thing." That line carried me for months. I used the provisional credit to pay my tuition deposit immediately. I can still recall the relief of the confirmation screen on the student portal. Deposit received, seat secured. Such bland words for a doorway that had nearly been burned behind me. I paid for uniforms, immunization titers, and 2 used textbooks from a graduating student named Kelsey, who met me in the parking lot outside campus with a trunk full of color-coded notes and said, "Nursing school will eat your life, but in a productive way." She had no idea she was handing books to someone who had just fought for the right to buy them. The bank's final findings arrived in early June. First Prairie concluded that the branch had failed to verify my identity, failed to compare signatures adequately, and improperly processed the closure after my grandmother's death, without sufficient safeguards, despite internal notes suggesting educational intent. They did not admit every ugly detail in writing, of course. Institutions rarely narrate their own shame with elegance. But they did enough. The branch manager, Todd Mercer, was placed on administrative leave and later reassigned out of customer-facing management. Jenna Roth received disciplinary action and mandatory retraining. The bank restored the full value of the CD Plus, reimbursed the early withdrawal penalty, and issued a formal apology to me and to Denise. They also flagged the matter for referral to county investigators. I did not celebrate the bank apology. I read it, filed it, and went to my evening shift. Vindication feels different when you still have to clock in at 6. But something inside me settled. For weeks I had been carrying the strain of proving reality to people who preferred family mythology. Now a bank letter, compliance report, and surveillance review had done what my tears never could. They had made the harm legible to systems. That matters. The surveillance summary itself was not given to me in full, but Denise obtained enough through the dispute process to understand the outline. On April 12th, my father entered the Waverly branch at 10:11 in the morning with Connor behind him. He approached a desk rather than the teller line first, spoke with Todd, then completed paperwork. Connor remained in the lobby area for part of the time and approached once to hand over what appeared to be an envelope. The footage did not have clear audio, but it had clarity enough to end the fiction that I had somehow been involved. When Denise told me this, I felt an odd sorrow for Connor. Not absolution. Sorrow. He had made himself into background scenery in a crime against his own sister because he wanted his life to stay easy. There was one more critical piece. Marjorie Caldwell provided an affidavit summarizing her conversations with my grandmother regarding the CD's educational purpose and prior refusal to permit diversion to my parents' household needs. Aunt Sheila provided her own statement about overhearing my father discuss using the funds for the roof and moving before I started asking questions. Older women with clear memories are dangerous to liars. I recommend them highly. My parents shifted strategy once the facts hardened. Publicly, they grew quiet. Privately, they tried to negotiate through shame. My mother sent a handwritten letter in June on cream stationery with blue flowers embossed at the top. She wrote that she regretted how things had been perceived and that perhaps we could move forward as a family if I agreed not to pursue criminal consequences. There was no direct apology, no naming of theft, no acknowledgement of the anonymous call to my school. She also included a line that told me exactly who she still was. "You know how one misunderstanding can ruin a man's reputation at your father's age." I gave the letter to Denise. We did not respond. My father attempted one phone call from an unknown number and left a voicemail when I did not answer. In it, he said, "I never wanted this to become official. That phrase enraged me in a cold, clarifying way. Become official. As if harm is only real when stamped. As if my future mattered less than his comfort, until a letterhead forced him to notice. I saved the voicemail too. Connor came to see me in person in July. It was hot enough that the hallway outside my apartment smelled like baked concrete and dryer sheets. He stood there in a faded ball cap, shifting his weight from one sneaker to the other, and asked if we could talk. Melissa happened to be unlocking her door at the same time, and gave me a look that asked a question without words. I nodded once. She stayed inside with her door cracked. Quiet support has many forms. Connor admitted more than he had at dinner, but less than total honesty probably required. He said Dad told him they were just moving money around, and asked him to drive because Mom wanted the car. He saw Dad practice my signature on a legal pad at the kitchen counter the night before. He did not stop him. He said when the bank employee asked where I was, Dad answered, "At work. She told me to handle it." Connor knew that was false. He also admitted my mother made the anonymous call to my school from a prepaid phone she bought at a drugstore in Waterloo because she thought a delay in my program might cool things off. His exact phrase was, "I didn't think she'd go that far." That is the sentence accomplices use when the floor finally opens under them. I asked him why he was telling me now. He looked miserable and said, "Because Aunt Sheila told me if I let you carry all of this alone, I'd spend the next 10 years telling myself I was young when really I was just weak." There it was. Human, not redeemed. He cried once, briefly, with the embarrassed anger of men who still think tears are evidence against them. I did not comfort him. I took notes after he left and sent a summary to Denise. By August, the county investigator had interviewed me, reviewed the documentation, and contacted the bank. Whether prosecutors would have pursued charges if the bank had not made me whole, I cannot say. Family fraud cases often die in the gap between what is morally obvious and what systems find worth the expense. In the end, perhaps because restitution had occurred, and perhaps because banks and counties each prefer tidy outcomes, criminal charges were not filed. Some viewers might want a courtroom. I understand that. I wanted one some days too. But imperfect resolution is still resolution if the truth stands and the harm stops spreading. The civil pressure did produce consequences. My father signed a repayment and indemnification agreement with the bank. I know because Denise received confirmation once the institution decided not to pursue me for any residual dispute. He had to cover fees and accept liability. Connor was named in internal records as a witness to the transaction and was interviewed separately. My mother's role in the school interference became known through Connor's statement and call records Denise subpoenaed in preparation, though we never had to fully litigate because the cease and desist and evidence were enough to make further contact stop. She never worked outside the home in a formal career, so there was no license to pull, no title to strip. Instead, the consequence landed where she had invested most of her power: reputation. Word spread at Grace Fellowship without a sermon. No one stood up to announce what had happened. People simply adjusted around my parents. My mother was quietly replaced as funeral meal coordinator by a woman named Teresa, who had better boundaries and worse casseroles. My father was no longer asked to lead men's breakfast. Invitations thinned. Their names came up in lowered voices after service near the coffee urn. I know because Beth told me months later that she had walked into the ladies' room and heard two women discussing that bank situation with the Bennetts, and one of them said, "Imagine doing that to your daughter for roofing and a transmission." Community consequence arrived on its own, exactly as it should. Nursing school started August 29th. The classroom smelled like dry erase markers, fresh binders, and nervous deodorant. There were 31 of us in the cohort. Our instructor, Professor Helen Russo, wore red reading glasses and opened with the words, "Competence is a kindness, to yourselves and to patients." I nearly cried right there because I had spent the whole summer inside the opposite lesson. I sat in the third row, clicked my pen, and wrote my name at the top of the first page as if reclaiming it from all prior misuse. The work was hard in the clean, exhausting way I had hoped. Clinicals began before dawn. My shoes squeaked on waxed floors. I learned medication calculations, wound dressing protocols, and how to smile gently at frightened people while my own life still had sharp edges at home. Melissa became my de facto evening checkpoint. Sometimes I would come in after 12 hours smelling like sanitizer and stale coffee, and she would slide a plate of reheated pasta across the counter and ask, "Scale of 1 to 10, how close are you to joining a goat farm?" It became our running joke. On the worst days, I said 11. I did not speak to my parents that fall. Not on my birthday in September, not at Thanksgiving, not when my mother sent a card with no apology inside, only the line, "The door is always open." Doors are not healing. Open doors without accountability are just easier access points for more harm. I spent Thanksgiving at Melissa's apartment with her son Jacob, who proudly mashed potatoes too aggressively, and Aunt Sheila, who brought green beans and a pie she slightly burned because she was on the phone, warning a friend not to co-sign a loan for her grandson. Chosen family is rarely cinematic. It is folding chairs, extra gravy, and someone remembering how you take your coffee. There is one small scene from that winter that I keep because it says more than legal outcomes ever could. In December, after my first semester finals, I drove to Waverly to leave flowers at Grandma's grave. The ground was hard and the air had that iron smell snow carries before it falls. I wore gloves with a loose seam in the thumb because I kept forgetting to replace them. While I was there, Marjorie Caldwell happened to pull in nearby. She had come to visit her husband. We stood by the cemetery gate talking about grades, weather, and whether Grandma would have approved of my haircut. Then Marjorie reached into her purse and handed me a peppermint from a little silver tin. "For the drive," she said. It was such an ordinary gesture, and it undid me more than the bank letter had. That is another thing people do not say enough. After betrayal, ordinary kindness can feel almost violent in its gentleness. It reminds you how little cruelty had to do with necessity. My parents did not have to do what they did. They chose it. Other people could just as easily choose the opposite. A peppermint, a banana bread, a timeline, a seat at a table that does not require you to disappear. Those things rebuild a life. By spring of 2023, I had straight A's in pharmacology and adult health, a new backpack because the old zipper finally failed, and enough emotional distance to tell the story without shaking. Denise closed my file after the bank's final restitution measures and the cessation of defamatory contact held for 6 months. When I thanked her, she said, "No, you made yourself an excellent client by telling the truth in a sortable way." It sounds funny now, but I loved her for that. She did not praise my suffering. She respected my method. I wish I could tell you that forgiveness arrived like sunlight through blinds, all warm and inevitable. It did not. Full forgiveness has not arrived yet. Maybe it never will. What has arrived is clarity. My mother did not steal because she was confused. My father did not forge because he was desperate in some heroic, tragic sense. They did it because they believed my future was available for extraction and that my age would make me easy to rewrite. Once I understood that, reconciliation stopped feeling noble and started feeling dangerous. I heard through Beth that my parents eventually refinanced the house to cover what the bank demanded from my father. Connor moved out and rented a place in Waterloo with 2 friends. He texts me on my birthday now. I reply sometimes, briefly. His one moment of reckoning at that table did not erase his earlier cowardice, but it changed the direction of his life enough that I no longer have to brace when I hear his name. That is as much grace as I have had to spare. Aunt Sheila remains exactly who she was. Last month she mailed me a clipping about hospital shoe inserts with a note that said, "Your grandmother would tell you your arches matter." Marjorie still sends a Christmas card with no extra sentiment, just her name and a line about weather. Melissa's son now thinks I can diagnose anything because I once identified strep from across a couch, which is not true and very much against protocol, but I enjoy the legend. These are the people at the edge of my life now. Steady, unspectacular, real. If you are listening because someone in your own family turned institutions against you and then told the room you were overreacting, I want to say something carefully. Documentation is not cold. It is care, especially when you have been raised around people who survive by re-narrating your pain. Keep the receipts, save the voicemails, write down the dates while your hands are shaking. Being methodical is not the opposite of being hurt. Sometimes it is the only respectful thing you can do for the version of yourself who will need proof later. The last time I saw my mother in person was at a grocery store in Cedar Falls about 8 months after the dinner. I was in scrubs, buying yogurt and paper towels. She was in the produce section, holding a bag of oranges. For a second, we looked like any mother and daughter crossing paths between errands. Then she opened her mouth, as if to begin one of those conversations built entirely from implication. I said, "Please don't." Not loudly, not cruelly, just exactly. She lowered the oranges back into the bin one at a time. She did not speak. That silence was the closest thing to an apology she has managed. These days, I work 3 12-hour shifts a week on a med-surg floor in Des Moines, where I moved after graduation for a hospital residency and a slightly bigger apartment with better light. I finished nursing school with honors. The license came in the mail on a Thursday afternoon in a white envelope that looked absurdly plain for something so hard-won. I opened it at my kitchen counter while Melissa, on video call from Cedar Falls, cheered loud enough to wake her dog. Aunt Sheila sent flowers. Marjorie mailed a card that read, "June would be pleased. Keep copies of everything." She underlined everything twice. On my days off, I do very ordinary things. I buy tulips when they are cheap. I meal prep badly seasoned chicken. I sit on my couch with one lamp on and chart my budget on Sundays because money still means structure to me, not fear, and I intend to keep it that way. Sometimes friends from work come over and we eat takeout in scrubs after late shifts, and somebody always leaves one hair tie and one sparkling water in my fridge. This is how I know I have a life now that belongs to me. It leaves harmless clutter. There is no reconciliation scene to offer you at the end. No holiday toast where everyone learns and hugs. My parents live with what they did and with the way people now look at them when church talk turns to family values. I live with a career they almost delayed, not because I triumphed through spectacle, but because I kept records and older women kept the truth alive until it had somewhere to land. Sometimes that is the win. Quiet, specific, unretractable. Last Sunday, after a long shift, I sat at my kitchen table with takeout soup, 2 coworkers, and Melissa, who was visiting for the weekend. Someone had brought a grocery store cheesecake with the plastic lid still fogged from the fridge. We were all tired. There were compression socks draped over a chair, a half-folded blanket on the couch, and the smell of garlic bread in the room. Melissa lifted her paper cup and said, "To people who show up with timelines and carbs." We laughed so hard one of my coworkers snorted. That was the sound in my apartment, not accusation, not defense, just women who chose to be there. And if that is not forgiveness, it is something close enough to peace that I can live inside it.